Hello and welcome to the World's Year in Review. I'm Beverly O'Connor. US President Donald Trump was inaugurated in January with a commitment to pursue an aggressive America First policy. But while he may have preferred to focus on domestic issues, the world continued to clamour for his attention. In April, North Korea launched a medium-range ballistic missile that reached the Sea of Japan. It was just the first of half a dozen missile tests. Meanwhile, the president's relationship with Russia came under increasing scrutiny. His Twitter habit set off a diplomatic spat with the UK, and he continued to challenge China on the trade imbalance with the US. Then his decision to move the US Embassy in Israel to the disputed city of Jerusalem sparked protests and violence across the Muslim and Arab world. Steve Kinane was in Jerusalem for the decision.
5 days after Donald Trump's announcement, anger still burns in the Arab world. Demonstrators threw stones and set fires as security forces barricaded the main road leading to the US Embassy in Beirut. The army fired tear gas and water cannons to disperse the crowd. Over the border, widespread protests in the Palestinian territories have largely died down. An Israeli security guard was stabbed while doing a routine search at the main bus station in West Jerusalem.
The terrorist was apprehended at the scene and is being questioned right now.
Police say the attacker was a 24-year-old Palestinian from the occupied West Bank. After meeting with the French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris, Israel's Prime Minister defended Donald Trump's decision.
It's always been our capital, and Jerusalem has never been the capital of any other people. I think the sooner the Palestinians come to grips with this reality, the sooner we'll move towards peace.
But the Palestinians are in no mood for negotiations. And one of the leaders of the Palestine Liberation Organization says the US can no longer mediate the peace process.
We will not engage in any peace process where the Americans are in control. Two, that we will take Israel to the International Criminal Court because we do need to protect ourselves, we do need accountability for Israel.
The latest violence in Jerusalem and Beirut poses problems for Donald Trump's policy shift. He said it would help achieve peace. In the short term, it's led to violence. Steve Kinane, ABC News, Jerusalem.
In April, the United States dramatically escalated its role in the Syrian conflict, launching more than 50 missiles at an airbase said to be the launch pad for a deadly chemical weapons attack. President Trump said the strike was in response to what he called a cruel and barbarous attack by the Syrian regime, which choked the lives of men, women and children. North America correspondent Zoe Daniel.
The world's biggest military power unleashes its might. 59 Tomahawk missiles fired from 2 warships in the Mediterranean Sea. Their target, a Syrian airbase, said to be the launch pad for a chemical weapons attack conducted with horrific results in Idlib province this week. Less than 3 months into his presidency, Donald Trump ordered the strike, using his unchallenged authority as Commander-in-Chief of the US military.
Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched. It is in this vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons.
US officials said the missiles hit aircraft, a landing strip and fuel stations. With this decision, Donald Trump has launched the US further into the Syrian conflict than his predecessor had ever dared. The new president was motivated by Syria's own actions.
There can be no dispute that Syria used banned chemical weapons, violated its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention, and ignored the urging of the UN Security Council.
Just last week, the Trump administration said regime change and military action like this were not a priority. But this week's events changed that. The president said these pictures had a big impact on him.
Assad choked out the lives of helpless men, women, and children. It was a slow and brutal death for so many. Even beautiful babies were cruelly murdered in this very barbaric attack. No child of God should ever suffer such horror.
Syrian state TV condemned what it called US aggression and repeated official denials the regime had used chemical weapons. The US action comes with immense risks. For more than a year and a half, Russia's been providing military and diplomatic support to the Assad regime. American officials said Russian forces were warned in advance of the airstrikes, and the parts of the airbase where Russians were present were not targeted. But Moscow is not happy, describing the strikes as an attack on a sovereign nation that violate international law, that'll do significant damage to US-Russia ties. And while 6 months ago the US and Russia were in talks on somehow bringing the war to an end, tonight it appears to be starting a new and dangerous phase.
Well, by far Donald Trump's biggest foreign policy challenge has been dealing with rogue nuclear state North Korea. The North has tested the new president's resolve and temperament with continuous provocation, multiple missile tests and a war of words. Rachel Mealy filed this report from Tokyo.
This is perhaps the gravest threat that North Korea has uttered so far. On the sidelines of the UN General Assembly meeting, an official suggested the rogue regime could detonate a hydrogen bomb in the Pacific Ocean.
In my view, I think a hydrogen bomb test might be carried out in the Pacific.
North Korea's leader described US President Donald Trump as mentally deranged and vowed to make the US pay dearly for his threats.
North Korea's remarks and behaviour are provocative to regional and international security, and they're absolutely unacceptable.
We don't want loss of life. That's the last thing anyone wants. But at the same time, we're not going to run scared. If, for any reason, North Korea attacks the United States or our allies, the U.S. will respond, period.
In New York, Donald Trump, together with Japan and South Korea, announced new financial sanctions aimed at starving Pyongyang of funds for its weapons programs.
This is a complete denuclearization of North Korea that we seek.
Mr. Trump says China's central bank is also cutting off the cash flow.
I want to just thank President Xi of China for the very bold move he made today. That was a somewhat unexpected move, and we appreciate it.
Merchant ships that visit North Korea will be barred from the US for 180 days in an attempt to halt all trade and enforce existing sanctions. Australia's Foreign Minister welcomed the extra measures.
Australia is of the view that we must put maximum economic pressure on North Korea to ensure that it is compelled to return to the negotiating table.
North Korea successfully tested a hydrogen bomb earlier this month and has twice sent intermediate ballistic missiles across Japan and into the Pacific Ocean. Today's threat to combine both is well within North Korea's capability. Rachel Mealy, ABC News, Tokyo.
And North Korea was high on the agenda of President Trump's combative debut at the UN General Assembly back in September. He painted a grim portrait of a world in peril, threatening North Korea and taking aim at the Iran nuclear deal. The ABC's Connor Duffy was in New York for the speech.
At the headquarters of the United Nations, the home of global diplomacy, Donald Trump was anything but diplomatic.
We will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
That was just the beginning. He attacked China and Russia for continuing to trade with Pyongyang.
It is an outrage that some nations would not only trade with such a regime, but would arm, supply, and financially support a country that imperils the world with nuclear conflict.
Then it was Iran's turn, the president hinting he might scrap a nuclear deal that eased sanctions in return for Tehran curbing its nuclear program.
Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it.
The exiting of the United States from such an agreement would carry a high cost, meaning that subsequent to such an probable action by the United States of America, no one will trust America again.
There were digs at Venezuela, Cuba, communism and socialism too. His remarks rattled world leaders.
When it becomes psychological commentary, then that's the end of politics and diplomacy.
This is supposed to be the house and the headquarters of the peace and the international law, and what we heard was the opposite of that. It's a president who comes for the first time and speaks about war, about destroying countries.
At lunch, the president toasted to the great potential of the United Nations and spoke briefly to Australia's foreign minister.
Did you have any concerns about the speech, and did you raise those with the president when you spoke to him?
I certainly didn't raise any concerns with the president. We spoke more generally about the challenges with North Korea.
The leaders Donald Trump attacked will have their own chance to respond on the world stage when they address the General Assembly later this week. The responses are expected to be robust, to say the least. Connor Duffy, ABC News, New York.
North Korea was still top of mind when Donald Trump made his first foray into Asia. He met leaders from across the region, but the biggest test for him came during the trip to China, a country he's accused of raping the United States on trade. China correspondent Bill Birtles filed this preview.
On the streets of Beijing, there's no love lost for the US president.
反正我不喜欢美国。
为什么呢？
因为觉得美国麻烦事太多了。
We can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing.
不希望美国，特别在台湾问题上，希望不要擦开。
China is ripping us off. You know who's getting the oil? China.
What China is doing to us is horrible.
对，肯定是有不一样，但是，我觉得很多你看到的都是表象，然后我希望它能更从本质上去改变美国，然后也能希望它促进中美的一些关系会变得越来越好，而不是这种激进的一些做法。
It's hard to believe that a man who went so hard on China during the campaign will be here as president in a matter of days. Donald Trump will have a superpower summit with China's leader Xi Jinping. But before that, another socialist leader will be on the agenda in Japan and South Korea. No two countries would bear the brunt of a North Korean missile strike more than South Korea and Japan. And experts say both countries hope Mr. Trump will assure them the US is committed to staying.
Well, the challenge with this particular administration is that the tweet diplomacy has created mixed messages in terms of how actors within the region are understanding the United States security commitment. We have the Secretary of State and General Mattis, as well as other national security advisors, giving strong statements of the United States' commitment to the region.
The US has beefed up its military presence, deploying a powerful anti-missile radar in South Korea to deal with the threat from Pyongyang.
It seems that Mr. Trump has prioritized the North Korean issue and denuclearization of the North in terms of how it sees relationships within the region. He seems to look at China as being the key factor, or the key state to be able to put pressure on North Korea and stop the missile development and nuclear development. And I think that will be the priority.
Stephen Nagy says the showpiece of the 12-day visit will be President Trump's meeting with Xi Jinping.
President Xi does have the upper hand. He's had some, I think, important successes. Those successes, of course, the island building in the South China Sea. That's a permanent facility now that's been militarized. We see in terms of the economic sphere, the Belt Road Initiative is bringing more partners within the region. When we compare the two leaders, President Xi seems to have had chalked up a few political wins, economic wins and security wins.
On North Korea, China has been tightening trade in recent months because of US pressure. Some North Korean exports, like textiles and seafood, have been banned. But Donald Trump wants Beijing to go further, to weaken the regime's ability to develop nuclear weapons.
China and the United States actually share the common goal of denuclearization. I think both China and the United States are firmly committed to that goal. There's no question about that. And there might be some slight, I think, some differences in terms of approach.
North Korea aside, one area where the two leaders need to find common ground is trade. And there's increasing signs this could happen.
中国坚持对外开放的基本国策，坚持打开国门搞建设。
China's president last month signalled the country could open its doors to more foreign investment. American companies complain that China is forcing ever more onerous rules on their businesses. They want more access, and US-China scholars like Professor Wang Dong say Beijing may give Donald Trump some ground.
Because we understand that there's a concern coming from the US side regarding the imbalances in trade. And I think China is very much willing to address that concern, so working together with our US counterpart.
On the surface, it's Donald Trump who'll be pushing for China to make concessions. But the US holds a surprising bargaining chip. This man. Guo Wengui is an eccentric billionaire who made his property fortune with the help of some high-level connections. He's now in self-imposed exile in the US, where he's used social media to make corruption allegations against high-level figures in China's government. Many of his claims are hard to verify. Some appear downright unlikely. But the YouTube videos from his New York apartment have made him a thorn in the side of the Communist Party.
I think that the Chinese government would be interested in getting him back.
If China's government steps up pressure on the US to deport Mr. Guo, it's going to be done quietly. China's confident that it's already got the upper hand over the US in Asia. Donald Trump will need every bargaining chip he can get.
Bill Birtles there. Well, Donald Trump didn't shy away from his campaign rhetoric during the trip to China. He lamented the trade imbalance between the two countries, calling it one-sided and unfair. On North Korea, both leaders agreed to stop Pyongyang's nuclear program. But as Matthew Carney reports, they didn't say how.
One of the best welcomes an American president has seen in decades. Full military honours, brass bands and a 21-gun salute. These leaders showed off a very warm relationship, but Mr. Trump wants to duel on a level economic playing field.
Right now, unfortunately, it is a very one-sided and unfair one.
In total, about $320 billion in business deals were signed off, but some were only memorandums of understanding. There was no clear agreement for access of American goods into restricted Chinese markets or protection of American intellectual property. Donald Trump doesn't blame China, but his predecessors.
Who can blame a country for being able to take advantage of another country for the benefit of its citizens? I give China great credit.
China has announced a number of steps to promote market access. This speaks volumes of the broad space for further economic and trade cooperation between the two countries.
Both leaders agreed that North Korea's nuclear program should be stopped. But again, there was no breakthrough here.
China can fix this problem easily and quickly.
Xi Jinping made no mention of cutting China's trade to the rogue regime as Trump wanted. It supplies 90% of North Korean trade, but doesn't want a humanitarian disaster on its doorstep. President Trump has been criticised that he's come to Beijing with no clear strategy on how to maintain American engagement in the region or to counter China's rise. Many China watchers are saying this will only lead to America's decline and China's ascendancy as a superpower. Both leaders emphasised building stronger relations, but on key issues they are still far apart. Matthew Carney, ABC News, Beijing.
Well, this year's G20 meeting wrapped up with two camps, Donald Trump and everyone else. The US president was left isolated as 19 other nations reaffirmed their commitment to the Paris Accord on climate change. It's the starkest example yet of Trump's approach to world affairs and has left other leaders to fill the void. Chris Uhlmann travelled with Malcolm Turnbull and filed this report from Paris.
In the end, the G20 became the G19. Donald Trump departed his second major international summit, and America was left isolated and diminished. The summary of the deliberations of the world's leading economies noted the decision of the United States of America to withdraw from the Paris Agreement on climate action. It added, the leaders of the other G20 members state that the Paris Agreement is irreversible. Host Chancellor Angela Merkel deplored the decision.
I think it's very clear that we could not reach consensus.
Donald Trump left Hamburg without holding a press conference to explain his stance. Also missing from the leaders' declaration was any condemnation of North Korea for its missile tests. Leaders were expecting the United States to push for it. 18 would have backed it, putting pressure on China and Russia. It's being seen by some observers as another sign that America is ceding its role as a global leader under President Trump.
Generally, I think it was a good outcome, but plainly there are some differences of opinion around the table.
The US president was an uneasy, awkward figure at this gathering of the G20, and you get the feeling that some world leaders are trying to find the best way of working around him. And so Donald Trump has pressed fast forward on the decline of the United States as a global leader. That risks ceding power to China and to Russia, two authoritarian states that will set a very different set of rules for the 21st century.
Well, Donald Trump used his first meeting with Vladimir Putin to raise the issue of Russian interference in America's presidential election. While their versions on that subject differed, they did manage to agree on a ceasefire for southern Syria. Our North America correspondent Zoe Daniel.
Nice to be with you.
Vladimir Putin has had such an impact on Donald Trump's presidency that it's hard to believe they've never met until today.
Of course, phone conversation is never enough. If we want to have a positive result, solving bilateral and critical international issues, then of course we need such personal meetings.
But there was an elephant in the room, the allegation that Russia interfered in the US election. These are the ones who insulted you, Putin said to Trump about the reporters in the room. Both giggled, but the president in the end did ask the question.
Here we go. Thank you.
The president pressed President Putin on more than one occasion regarding Russian involvement. President Putin denied such involvement.
President Trump said he'd heard President Putin's clear statements that this isn't true and Russia didn't interfere in these elections, and that he accepts these statements.
Held up as a sign of progress was an agreement to attempt a new ceasefire in Syria, this one in the country's southwest, to begin this weekend.
I think this is our first indication of the US and Russia being able to work together in Syria.
But consensus on resolving tensions on the Korean peninsula was more difficult. As the US pursues what it calls a peaceful pressure campaign, Russia continues to oppose tighter sanctions.
The US says while it's time to move forward, it does want a commitment that Russia won't interfere in American politics, and a framework will be developed to counter cyber threats. No further meetings are planned between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin for now. Zoe Daniel, ABC News, Washington.
Well, it became known as the incredible shrinking summit. The US president shortened a meeting with Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull so that he could linger in Washington to gloat over a major congressional victory. It was the first time the two leaders had met face-to-face since a terse phone call over the US-Australian refugee deal earlier in the year. Here's North America correspondent Zoe Daniel in New York.
After 100 years of mateship, What's a few hours' delay between friends?
For nearly a century, Americans and Australians have fought together, bled together, and died together as brothers and sisters.
From the mud of Hamel to the waters of the Coral Sea to the sands of the Middle East today, Australians and Americans stand shoulder to shoulder defending our freedoms.
It was their first meeting since that terse phone call over the US-Australia refugee deal. But apparently that's a non-issue.
You know, they said we had a rough phone call. We really didn't have a rough phone call, did we? Everyone's talking about this phone call.
And despite the hours-long delay, there was no apparent lingering tension. Quite the reverse.
I love Australia. We have a fantastic relationship, but I love Australia, always have.
Malcolm Turnbull met with the Joint Terrorism Task Force and the head of the US Pacific Fleet this morning. He then cooled his heels while the President celebrated the passage of his policy to overhaul healthcare through the House.
But we want to brag about the plan because this plan really... Uh-oh. Oh.
This is what the people look like.
It's the President's first trip back to his hometown since the inauguration, and not all were happy about it. But it was the veterans of the Battle of the Coral Sea 75 years ago that both leaders came to see.
Great to see you. Great to see you too.
It was a fight that helped forge a lasting alliance between the two countries.
You saved Australia and you turned the tide of war.
That's right.
The first of a series of events to mark 100 years of mateship, it attracted a stellar crowd from business, politics and defence.
These are dangerous times, and we must be, as this great carrier is called, intrepid.
The two leaders have sat together for a lengthy dinner here on this World War II aircraft carrier this evening. It's an appropriate forum at a time of mounting global threats, among them North Korea, which was the main item on the agenda. Testy phone call or not, it's clear the alliance remains strong, especially on military matters.
We are proudly and profoundly grateful for Australia's contributions in Syria, Iraq and Afghanistan.
Asked if he'll visit Australia soon, the President said, that will happen. Zoe Daniel, ABC News, New York.
Well, you can head to the ABC's World News page for all the latest international headlines. I'm Beverly O'Connor. Thanks so much for your company. Bye-bye.